Hi everyone, today I'm going to be showing you the best settings for the Olympus OM1. Now these settings are best for beginning photographers, people just getting started in photography, and also maybe new to the Olympus OM1. Also, we're going to be breaking the settings down into two groups. One group of settings is going to be ideal for just general photography, like your photo walks or capturing the important events in your life. And another group of settings are going to be more geared towards like the sports action wildlife type of photography to help you capture those decisive moments. And then we're going to save those settings so that you can recall them anytime you want to very quickly. So let's get started. Now, before we go into the menu and start changing settings, let's just take a look at the buttons and dials on the camera that we'll be using. Now, the most important dial on the camera is, of course, the mode dial, and this changes how we take our pictures or record movies. We're also going to be changing the function of the record button here so it actually records movies, because by default it does not. And then the shutter button itself, just be aware that this is a two-function button. You can half press the shutter button where you just feel a light resistance before it comes to a stop, and then you have to give it a full press where it'll actually take a picture. And then we're also going to be using this front dial here and also the rear dial here to also change settings. Now over here is just simply the power on off switch, like so. And then this is your autofocus settings, and these are your shutter mode settings. And we really probably won't be using these very much. Now on the side of the camera, right on the viewfinder, is a diopter adjustment, which you may need to adjust so that you can see a clear image inside the EVF. I have to adjust this quite a bit for my dying eyes, or maybe you wear glasses. This adjustment will help you get a sharp image inside the EVF. Now looking at the back of the camera, we have a lot of buttons here that we'll talk about. We're going to primarily be using the menu button and the OK button here with the D-pad. So these are the two main buttons that I use the most. We also have a joystick here, which is very similar to the D-pad. They perform a lot of the same functions, but this is just in a joystick form. And this also has, or it's also pressable, just like the OK button. So take a few minutes here to go over the buttons and dials, turn on the camera, push the buttons, turn the dials, see what they do, but also get a feel for the joystick button and how it feels to press that in, and also the shutter button, and get a feel for what is half pressing the shutter and fully pressing the shutter button, because that'll be very important in some of the settings that we use. All right, let's go ahead and turn on the camera. And if you've made any changes at this point, it doesn't matter because we're going to do a full reset onto the camera. And to do that, we need to go into the menu system. Now to go into the menu, of course, we just push the menu button. And now the touchscreen is actually disabled, and we'll have to use the buttons and dials to navigate the menu. Now to navigate the menu, we have to understand its basic structure. So what we have here at the top is a row of tabs that group the various function categories together, and related functions will be on individual pages within this tab. So to change the category or the tab, I like to rotate the front dial. So when I'm rotating the front dial, you'll see that it goes from one group to the next, like so. And then once we've selected the group or tab that we want, we can navigate to the different pages within this tab for the various functions or related functions that we can control. And if we continue, it'll just roll over to the next tab and so on. But let's go back to the shooting menu tab. Now from here, I want to reset the camera back to its factory defaults so that we can all be on the same page. So I'm going to rotate the front dial and go over here to the wrench menu. And then I'm going to rotate the rear dial to go to the correct page. And it happens to be on the last page, page number 6, where it says reset and initialize settings. So it's now highlighted, so I just push the OK button. And then I have two options here, reset shooting settings or initialize all settings. So reset shooting settings are things like shutter speed, aperture, ISO, maybe a picture profile, just very basic settings. But initialize all settings clears the camera of any custom settings that you might have. I mean, it resets just basically everything to its factory defaults, except for, the date and time, and maybe your language setting, and also your copyright information. But other than that, it's a full reset. So it gives us a confirmation page. We say yes, and then we click OK. Now, one more thing I'm going to adjust before we get started is the brightness of this monitor, because you may have noticed it got a little bit brighter. So all I need to do is go into, looks like menu number 3, and click monitor adjust. And I'm just going to dim this down so that it's just easier to see. And of course, you can make the monitor brighter or darker to your taste. Particularly when you're outdoors, you may want to make the monitor brighter so it's easier to see. There's also adjustments here for the EVF. I usually just leave this on auto, and then we'll just ignore the rest of the settings for now. All right, now let's get into the good stuff, and that's the best settings for beginning photographers. And as you remember, we're going to set up 2 different groups of settings. The first group is going to be primarily for general photography, like for your photo walks and events. And then the second group of settings will be more for sports, action, wildlife type photography. So let's get started. Now, the first thing I want you to do is put the camera into aperture priority mode. Now, this is a mode that I think most photographers use regardless of skill level because it gives you the greatest amount of control over the look of your image. So, for example, if you're doing a portrait and you want a blurry background, you can set the aperture to its widest setting or lowest aperture number to give you that blurry background. And if you want to get things in focus, like in a landscape, you can use higher aperture numbers like f8 so that everything will be in focus. Now, also when you're in aperture priority mode, the camera will take control of the shutter speed and the ISO to help you get the correct exposure. Now, I have a complete tutorial on aperture called Understanding Aperture for Beginners, and that will help you understand all the different creative things you can do with aperture. But for today, in this video, I'm going to just give you a few tips to help you get started. All right, now fortunately, most of the settings we need to change are in the Super Control panel, and that's what's showing up here by default. And if your screen is blank, the camera went to sleep, all you have to do is just kind of tap the shutter button and it'll bring it back alive. Now, I don't like to be in this particular mode, which is showing the Super Control panel all the time. What I like to do is go into live view mode. So I'm going to push the live view EVF button here to kind of toggle so that the live view is now showing, and this will give me a view of what the camera is actually seeing. And then to get to the Super Control panel from here, all I have to do is push the OK button. Now, if I don't touch the screen or change anything in the Super Control panel, it's going to automatically time out and take me back to the live view mode, just like so. So to go back into the Super Control panel, I'll just click the OK button, and you're going to see me do that time to time throughout the tutorial because while I'm explaining things, the Super Control panel is going to time out. Now, to navigate the Super Control panel, it is touchscreen active, so I can jump to an individual setting, but I prefer personally just to use the D-pad like so to go to the setting that I want. Because sometimes it's not very responsive. Maybe your hands are dirty or you're wearing gloves. So that's why I prefer to use the D-pad. I'm just much faster this way for me. But if you prefer using a touch screen, you can do it that way if you like. Now, let's talk about what's on the Super Control panel. Now, before we make any changes, let me address why these numbers are blinking. And that's because I have the lens face down on this black table, so the camera doesn't know how to expose for that. And that's why these are blinking, to let you know that you're not going to get a correct exposure. So the first thing we're going to change actually is our AF target mode. And we're going to click OK on that. And then we can rotate the rear dial to change the AF target mode. So I'm going to change this to a single point. And the reason I like using a single point is that way I can control exactly what I'm going to focus on in the frame. So let me show you that. Now, when I go into the Super Control panel, click this, I can control where this focus point is anywhere in the frame, and the camera is going to focus only on that point. And to go back to the center, I can just click on the joystick and it'll recenter the focus point. So let's see how this works in real life. I'm just pointing the camera in my studio here. And if you look right in the center, you can see a little black outline of where the focus point is. And by using the joystick, I can move the focus point around. So say, for example, I want to put the flowers here in the left thirds of the frame. I can move the focus point over, say, to this white flower so that it focuses only on this white flower. And then I can just half press the shutter button to confirm focus and fully press the shutter button to take the picture. And that's how that works. And then I can just move the joystick, click it, and recenter it. If I had used, say, something else like a much larger focus area, See where the green dot's going? I don't know where the camera's going to focus because the camera is choosing the autofocus point for me. So that's why I like to select a single point and then control it myself where it's going to focus. Now the next thing is the exposure compensation box. And if I click OK on this, I can change the exposure compensation indexed in terms of stops. So as I go +2 or +2 stops, the image gets brighter, and I can rotate the dial in counterclockwise and the image gets darker. So this is an easy way to adjust the exposure to compensate for, say, like backlighting and other things that are throwing the camera's meter off. However, if we go to the live view and you look at the bottom here, you'll see that we have f2.8 in yellow, and we also have the exposure compensation 0.0 in yellow. And the little icon above it is telling us that we can either use the front or rear dial to control it without going into the super control panel. So the aperture in this case has a half circle or half dial pointing down. That means we can control the aperture with the rear dial. So as I'm rotating it here, I can change the aperture to a higher number or go back to a lower number. And then the exposure compensation has a half dial pointing upwards. That means I can control it using the front dial on the camera. So this is controlling aperture, the rear dial here, and then the front dial is controlling exposure compensation. Now the next setting we want to look at is the color profile. Right now the default setting is set to natural. And if you look over here on the left, you can see that we can change additional settings for sharpness, contrast, saturation, and also gradation. And my personal taste, I like to use the auto gradation. Now see what happens to the image from normal to auto. And basically what it's doing is pulling up the shadows a little and pulling down the highlights a tiny bit just to kind of balance the exposure a little better. And the other thing I should note is that these changes that you make here on the left side only affect the JPEG image. So if you like to shoot straight out of camera, you can experiment with these settings, and adjust them to taste. But I think the default settings are fine. Now the other thing you can do is go back up to the top and you can change to, say, a monochrome profile. You can also go into your art filters here. And there's a bunch of them here you can try. And these are a lot of fun. I use these time to time. But as a default setting, natural is probably the best one to start with. Now the next setting is the white balance. And by default, it's set to auto. And the camera does a good job at balancing the colors in the image. But when we click on it, you can see we also have another sidebar menu. So what I recommend is you change Keep Warm Color on and change that to off, like so. And then this is just for fine-tuning the white balance if you want to get creative, but you can leave that as is for now. Now let me elaborate on the Keep Warm Colors on or off. Basically it only works indoors when you're under artificial lighting, say from like a tungsten light bulb or halogen light bulbs. They tend to cast very warm, yellowish light onto the scene. And when you turn Keep Warm Colors on, the camera will try and keep those colors in the image. So your images will look a little bit yellow. So I turn Keep Warm Colors off so that the camera will adjust for the white balance and make the scene look a little more natural. And that's just my personal preference. You can experiment a little on and off and see what you think. And again, this only really works indoors under that kind of artificial lighting. When you're outdoors or doing any other kind of scenes where there's no artificial lighting or you're using flash, this Keep Warm Colors setting has no effect. Now the next setting is the button function. And this is just a shortcut to the button function menu in the camera. And what you can do is you can reprogram almost all of the buttons on the camera to do something else other than what it's assigned to in this menu. So we can reassign the record button to actually do movie recording, because right now the default setting is high-res shot mode. So I'm going to scroll around until I find record, which is right here, and click OK. So now when I push the record button, it will actually start recording a movie or a video. Now the next mode we're going to look at is the autofocus mode. And by default, it's set to single autofocus. So what that means is like when you have pressed the shutter button, the camera will focus once. And then when you fully press the button, it'll take the picture. So that's the best and easiest way to use autofocus. Now there are other modes here like continuous autofocus and manual focus and tracking and presets and Starry Sky AF. We'll talk about those in another video. But for a beginner, I think single point autofocus is best. Now what this allows you to do is just quickly point to where you want to focus, half push the shutter button, then move over, recompose, and take the picture. So it's what's known as focus and recompose. If I were in continuous autofocus like this, what happens is when I half press the shutter button up here, it'll acquire focus, but then when I move the camera back to recompose, you can see it's trying to refocus on something else. So that's why I like to use single point autofocus most of the time. Now the next setting is face detect, and we can turn this on to detect people's faces, or we can set it to detect the face and the eye, etc. And these modes are good if you're doing portrait photography, but as a beginner, it's probably better just to focus and recompose like I just showed you, where you pick the focus point yourself. Now the next setting we're going to look at, and we're going to skip over the flash settings, is the shutter mode. Now right now it's set to take one picture when you push the shutter button, which is fine, but I recommend you change this to silent single, where it just takes a single picture in electronic shutter for completely silent operation. Now there's certainly reasons to use mechanical shutter that I won't go into right now. Just use electronic or silent shutter for now, because it'll give you access to other features in the camera that we can use later. And there's also a lot of benefits to using electronic shutter. So if you want to know more about the different shutter modes and why you would use different shutter modes, check out my series for beginners on shutter modes. Now the next setting we're going to look at are the metering modes. And the default setting is ESP, which is basically an intelligent metering system where the camera will look at the scene and determine what the best exposure should be. And if it's off a little or it gets it wrong, I can always dial in some exposure comp by rotating the front dial like so, and I can get the exposure that I want. Now, just quickly on the other metering modes, there's center weighted metering where it sort of averages what's in the middle to give you the exposure. And then there's spot metering where it looks only in that center circle for the exposure. So you can see as I move the spot around, it's going to try and measure only in that spot and try and give you an exposure there. And this is handy for some more advanced type photography. And I do have videos on this separately. And then there's spot high and spot low. And basically what it's doing is it's looking inside that circle and then adding a stop or two of exposure for that part. So I don't find these too useful. As you can see, like if I go over here, it's just way too bright. Some people use it, but I think it's just easier to dial in exposure comp. And then spot shadow is just looking in the shadow areas and subtracting two stops roughly. So again, I think it's just easier to use exposure comp than to use these fancy metering modes. So we'll put this back into ESP, and that's what I recommend. Now the next setting is aspect ratio, and I recommend you leave this in 4:3. You can try these other aspect ratios, but if you look at the numbers at the top, that tells you what the resolution of the image is. And you can see that the images lose quite a bit of resolution as we choose these different formats. Now, these are fine if you want to be a little creative or you want to experiment with different aspect ratios, but these settings only affect the JPEG. When you set these settings, they really have no impact on the RAW other than when you import it into Lightroom or Olympus Workspace, it's going to be cropped when you import the raw image. But if you edit the image, you can uncrop it back to its original 4:3 ratio. Now the next setting is about image stabilization, and there's several modes here, and these are a little bit specialized for different kinds of photography. I just recommend as a beginner, just leave it on auto and the camera will do most of the work for you. Now of course there are times when you want to use these other modes, but we'll talk about those in another video. All right, the next settings have to do with the card slot settings, and I've already inserted 2 SD cards into the camera. So when we click on that icon, it takes us into the card slot settings menu. And let's go into the save settings. And I recommend you start with dual independent. So just reading it quickly, it saves to both cards applying their respective settings. Even if one card becomes full, the other can still be saved to. Now all this setting does is tell the camera which SD card slot do you want to show images from. And this can be changed on the fly while you're playing back your images, but you can just leave that to card slot 1. Now if we look at the top center of the live view, it'll tell us all of our card slot settings. So we're in dual independent. We can save 9,999 photos or more. Card slot number 1 is assigned to save the video files, and we can save up to 1 hour and 22 minutes and 19 seconds in length total, assuming there's no other files on that card. And then card slot number 1 for pictures is set to capture large fine, or LF, which is a JPEG format. And card slot number 2 is also set to record large fine, LF, or that's a JPEG format. So let's go into the Super Control panel, and you can see it's telling us here that we're in dual independent mode, and we're going to change what we save to card slot number 1. And what I recommend is LSF plus RAW, which stands for large superfine, plus a RAW file. So you're going to get 2 files saved for each picture. One is a JPEG in the highest quality format that the camera is capable of, and the other file will be a RAW image that is, the intent is that you're going to edit those in post-processing. So I recommend you save both, and then we're going to do the same thing for card slot number 2. Now if you look at the live view, it's telling us that we can only save 3,297 images to each card, or to card slot number 1, we can save 1 hour and 22 minutes and 19 seconds in video. And that's based on the 4K 60p 8-bit recording mode. And again, these are just estimates, and I found them to be pretty accurate. But now looking at card slot number 1 and 2, it's reflecting the changes we made in the Super Control panel. So we'll be capturing large superfine plus RAW on each card. So the way we have it set up is every time we take a picture, that picture is going to be saved to both memory cards. And each picture is going to have 2 files, one JPEG and one RAW. And if we record any movies, that's going to be saved to card slot number 1 only. However, if we record a lot of movies, card slot number 1 can get full very fast. So once card slot number 1 gets full, the pictures will still be saved, but they're going to go to card slot number 2. But there won't be any backup for it on card slot number 1. Now there's just a couple of more things we need to do, and we have to go in the menu to do it. So let's click the menu button. And then we're going to go in shooting menu number 1, and we're going to go all the way over here to the drive mode tab. And we're going to turn anti-flicker shooting on. So this will help reduce banding and things that you might see when you're using a silent or electronic shutter. Now the last thing we need to do is go into shooting menu number 1, and we're going to go to the first page here for custom mode. And we're going to save everything we just set into C1. So we'll click OK, click Assign, and click Set, and we're all done. So if we go back, you can see C1 is now set. So now, no matter what changes we might make when we're out in the field, we can always go back to all those settings we just set up by turning the mode dial to C1. So those are all of the settings that I recommend for your general photography. And those are actually about 99% the same as the settings that I use in my own personal photography. And hopefully understand why I chose the settings that I did so that it's easier for you to make any changes that's better for your own photography. But let's move on now to setting up the camera for sports action wildlife type photography. And this will be very, very quick because the settings are very similar. The only thing we really need to change is the shutter mode. So the first thing we need to do is go into shutter priority mode. So shutter priority mode is basically we take control of the shutter speed, and then the camera will handle the exposure by adjusting the aperture and ISO automatically for us. And then of course we can always dial in a little bit of exposure comp like I showed you before if it's just a little bit off or we want to make some changes. Now when it comes to setting the correct shutter speed for like sports action wildlife photography, It really depends on what kind of sports action wildlife we're taking. So here are some basic guidelines. If we're talking about sporting events where it's people playing football or soccer, what have you, I would recommend at least 1/1000th of a second. And if we're talking about like animals, like dogs and cats playing, I would say closer to 1/2000th of a second is ideal. And if we're talking about birds or birds in flight, especially smaller birds, I would be closer to 1/4000th of a second. So let's go ahead and set up the shutter speed default to be 1/1000th of a second, and then it'll be very easy to adjust from there. So as you can see, we're in shutter priority mode, and if I click the OK button to go into the super control panel, you'll see that all of our settings from aperture priority carried over to the shutter priority mode. Now, the first thing we want to change for sports action photography is the autofocus mode. We're going to change this to continuous autofocus. And then we're going to change the shutter mode from single silent or electronic shutter to sequential high speed shutter mode number 2. And I'll explain that in just a moment. Now, one more thing we should do is actually turn on face detect and then change our targeting point to a 5-point cross. And then on this screen, let's change our shutter speed to 1/1000th of a second. And now let's just save everything to our custom mode. So we'll go into the menu, custom mode. We'll save it to C2, assign, set, and we're done. Now the beauty of using the custom settings is when I go out for a photo walk, I can just set it up for C1 and I'm ready to go. But if while I'm on my photo walk, I see like an eagle flying, I can quickly go to C2 for my sports action wildlife settings and get a shot of the eagle. And then when he flies away, I can just go back to my normal photography. Now let me elaborate just a little bit on the sports action wildlife settings. Now on the autofocus target points, I went from a single point to that larger 5-point box. And the reason I did that is because if you were in a single point and you're trying to track a fast moving object, as a beginner, it's really, and even advanced photographers, it's really hard to get your subject right on that little point. So using a larger box makes that a lot easier, and you're more likely to acquire focus on your subject. Also, the shutter mode that I chose, SH2, is a very fast continuous shutter with autofocus. So when you hold the shutter button down, it's going to capture roughly 25 frames per second up to 50 frames per second, depending on the lens you're using, while you're holding the shutter button down. So you're more likely to capture that decisive moment. So maybe it's the position of the wings on a bird. Maybe it's right after somebody kicks the soccer ball, and you can capture that moment when the soccer ball is just leaving their foot, what have you. And it's a very advanced mode with autofocus. And that's why I changed the autofocus mode from single AF to continuous AF so that the camera will continuously refocus with every frame. And then we also turned on the face detect just in case you're taking pictures of people. The camera should be able to lock onto the person's face to help you get better focus. Now I know that was a lot of settings, but once you've saved them to C1, you don't have to think about them anymore. All you have to do is, if you're in C1 for your general photography, just set your aperture and exposure comp. And then when you go to your sports action wildlife setting in C2, all you have to do is set your shutter speed and exposure comp there. So it really simplifies your photography while still getting really great results. Now, you really have to go out and practice, of course, and learn all of the different techniques of photography and composition and understanding shutter speed and aperture. And again, I have a whole series on photography for beginners that you can watch. I'll put a link to the playlist at the end of this video. So I hope you like this video. If so, click the like button now, and also share it on your social media so that other photographers can learn from this as well. And I'll be continuing this series on the OM1 and also my series for photographies for beginners. So be sure to check those out and subscribe so you don't miss those. And if you can, buy me a coffee or two. It makes making these videos a lot easier for me. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.